This is a Raspberry Pi, and this is the Raspberry Pi Pico. Hi, I am Raghu, and in this series of tutorial, I will explain about how to use the Raspberry Pi Pico to develop embedded applications using Python. First of all, what is the Raspberry Pi? Now, the Raspberry Pi, as most of you already probably know about, is a single board computer which is almost the size of a credit card. It is capable of running a full-blown Linux on it. So when the Raspberry Pi was introduced way back in 2012, after that, it has taken the entire community of electronic hobbyists, academic community of teachers and trainers, and also the sort of computing world by storm. This is because in such a small computer or such a small PCB or a board, we are able to run a fairly good and a strong version of Linux. And in fact, it's extremely easy to load Linux onto the Raspberry Pi, and that makes it much more friendly. And the Raspberry Pi, apart from having Linux and being a full-blown computer, also exposes a series of around 40 GPIO pins. Now, what exactly is the GPIO pins? How do we use it? Or what is the use of that? I will tell more about it later on. But for now, I'll just give an overview and a short introduction that a GPIO stands for General Purpose Input Output. So what it means is that you could connect external input devices or output devices to that. What's an output devices? It could simply be a light bulb. It could simply be a fan. Any of these, when you connect them, these can be connected easily using the GPIO pins. Now, an input pin is usually a sensor. It could be a light sensor, a temperature sensor. So you might want to say that when I want to check the light level, and based on that turn on an external light, or if the temperature is too high, then I'll turn on the fan or AC or whatever. That's what the GPIO input pins are for. We'll see how to do more about it later on. So all of those GPIO pins are there on the Raspberry Pi. However, if you want to use a Raspberry Pi to do simple I/O operations like switching on lights, switching off fans, checking the temperature, checking the light level, then it is an overkill to use a full-blown computer to do all these things. You could do that with a small microcontroller. So what we had to do all these days was that although the Raspberry Pi was working very well as a server, but for doing automation of control of lights, control of fans, or control of any devices, and reading temperatures and doing all these kind of things, we would use a much simpler microcontroller like an Arduino or an ESP8266. So now Raspberry Pi Foundation has addressed that issue by coming out with the Raspberry Pi Pico. The Raspberry Pi Pico is a microcontroller. Unlike the other Raspberry Pis, it is not a single board computer, and so you can't run a regular Linux or do many of the things that you would do with your computer. But this is what we need and what is enough for developing any automation product or an embedded application. So that's the gap that the Raspberry Pi Foundation has addressed by bringing out with this microcontroller. Now, this microcontroller again is available in various places where you could buy off the stores now, or you could help us by buying it from the website that's shown below. And as Steve Jobs would put it, one more thing. Now, we here at Quantum have a series of development boards which we call as IoT project development boards. In this, what we do is that we break out the microcontroller in such a way that it is useful to build or more easy to build projects. So we already have it for the ESP8266 and for an Arduino Shield for the Arduino. So what happens is that you could use these connectors to directly connect to your sensors and most common sensors and actuators. And this is not just a Wi-Fi board, but this is like an IoT board. So you could connect to various IoT platforms like AWS or Adafruit or Google Firebase, and most of the common ones you could connect to and build your projects. So we already have it for the ESP8266 and for the Arduino. And as I'm speaking and as I'm building these tutorials and I've started it, we are also coming out with one for the Pico. It's still work in progress, but in a couple of weeks we should have it ready. And so I would be driving many of the tutorials using that the project shield or the project board, because that makes it very easy to actually connect your sensors even if you don't know anything about electronics. So that's one thing that I would like to say before we go on, and let's go on and see the next in the series of these tutorials. And in the next series I will just give a brief introduction about how to get started with Raspberry Pi Pico and Python.